Welcome everybody to the workshop on social justice issues for debating, and we are joined by Peace John-Kalio. They are one of the most experienced debaters that I've known and have had an opportunity to talk to for a while from Africa, and I'm pretty sure that their conversations and descriptions on different social issues and how they are to be debated would be something which is valuable as an input point for all of us today. Peace, thank you so much for coming on board and agreeing to take this workshop. I'll hand over to you. You can begin whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here. I hope we're able to have an amazing session. So I think we can just begin without any further ado. So I think before I start the workshop or part of the workshop, I'm going to preface by saying that I always say this before I start any workshop or teaching because I feel it's very important to know that no matter what anybody teaches you in any workshop, I think it's not going to be useful if you do not put in the work yourself, obviously. So that is, practice, train, and so many other things that debaters have to do personally to improve their skills, right? But secondly, I think a very important gap I've noticed in the debate circuit is that there has been a dwindling of how people read. That is, I do not see people reading a lot, at least to keep up with social issues, to keep up with international relations that is happening. And like this is so evident in because this year I've spent majority of the year judging. I've done less of speaking, but I've done more of judging, and I have seen and judged and watched a lot of debates, and sometimes it's painfully obvious to see that debaters are not really reading anymore. So I think that in order to be able to use strategy, you need information too. So you need to know what's happening in the world. That is how you're able to strategize arguments in the first place to win any type of debate, and obviously to win social justice movement debating, because I think this also a type of these are types of motions that you need to know what is going on, right? So you cannot argue for a minority if you do not know what those minority needs or what is their issues and their main talking points. I think like that's very important to preface, right? So anyways, let's begin then officially. Introduction. I think the goals of the session are there are five goals of the session. One, to understand what social justice motions are and why they are unique. Two, learn how to analyze them without being emotionally overwhelmed. Three, learn principled framework that judges expect. Four, practice building strong arguments in social justice context. And five, understand how to avoid common traps. That is moralizing, oppression Olympics, and empty empathy. And these are going to become more clearly as I go on with this session. Okay, so what makes social justice motions feel more difficult than regular motions? I think there are several reasons I've noticed in the debate round, and like people saying generally. It's firstly sensitivity of topics. I think this is why even it's not all social justice movements that that CA sets motions on, especially like depending on how sensitive the issue is and how probably recent the issue is. Just for an example now, in Nigeria, you might hardly see motions about tribalism and stuff because like it's a very, very sensitive issue right now within the context of Nigerian politics. So that's how sensitive these topics are, that sometimes people even avoid setting motions on them. Secondly, it's more difficult because obviously there's a need for empathy. So you cannot come and talk about minorities in just a rash manner or like you like in a very harsh manner without or with some, let's say, bigoted undertones. So like you actually need to be careful of how exactly we debate these particular motions because there is like at least a little bit of need of empathy within those motions. Three, heavy moral and principled elements. So like social justice motions there's a lot of principled arguments, principled elements within those motions, and sometimes this may be difficult for some people. Fourthly, identity-centered harms. So the harms are mostly tied to how it's going to affect certain people's identity, whether this looks like class, race, gender, etc. And obviously, lastly, it's sometimes seems a little bit difficult to weigh than other emotions, right? So I think then understanding social justice motions. What are social justice motions? So these are motions dealing with marginalized groups, structural injustice, inequality, discrimination, identity, which looks like race, gender, sexuality, disability, and class, historical oppression, and redistribution, reparations, and recognitions. So motions that center these issues, right? One or more of these issues are generally what we refer to as social justice motions, and obviously social justice debating. So examples in real life would look like this house regrets the narrative that marginalized people must forgive their oppressors, or this house will allow minority only political parties, or this house believes that social movements should prioritize radical direct action over institution engagement. So these are examples of maybe quite a few popular social justice motions that have existed. So then, as I've already explained, why they may seem a little bit hard and more difficult than other motions because of the high emotional content. So, principal burdens are heavy, requires understanding of lived experiences without stereotyping, and easy to make arguments sound nice but not impact weighted. And I think I have to expand mainly on the third point because I see that the reason why a lot of people feel uh, social justice motion is tied to the very first thing I said before this, that people do not read, right? And a lot of debaters, like, if you're not reading, it's also less likely that you're going to be open minded. So, for example, now, people I've known personally within circuits, at least within my circuit and all, and I know maybe their personal politics would generally let their personal politics affect how they debate social justice movement. So maybe they're not so hugely feminist. It's good. It's mainly then you see them debating feminist motions, and then you understand that, oh, they do not really understand feminism as a whole. And this is because maybe they struggle to relate with the lived experiences of like the minorities that these are these motions are involved with. Or like as I said, if you allow your personal politics to affect the way you debate, it's gonna be a huge problem. So even if maybe you're not the biggest feminist, if you're a debater, it's you have to like really know about feminism, understand feminism and stuff, because obviously you're gonna see motions on this. So uh you have to like at least put yourself in the shoes and the lived experiences without necessarily stereotyping. And the stereotyping issue, I think it's very like it's a big issue because obviously it's even against like equity and all for people to stereotype. So like it should be common knowledge that you should know that if you are debating a social justice motion, you shouldn't generally say, oh, black people are known to be this, or women are known to be this, or stuff like that. So you should avoid generalizations in social justice motions. Obviously, apart from this may not be the best strategy in the round, is might also offend like people that do belong to these minority classes that might be listening to your speech during that moment. So then the four lenses of social justice debating. These are various analytical tools to use when you argue social justice motions. The analytical tools are firstly identity lens. So who is affected, which subgroups, which internal conflicts. As I said, that's why you need to know the information on these particular issues. So who does this motion mostly affect, and what are their conflicts? What particular issues are affecting them? What did they say that they want? Those are that's what is I classify under identity lens. Then secondly is power lens. So who has the power? Who lacks power? And what structures maintain this particular power? So an example would look like patriarchy, the caste system, capitalism, whiteness, ableism, stuff like that. So, for example, now, if you're talking about emotion on capitalism, you're gonna know, okay, um, who has the power? That would be like the elites and people who, like the 1%. If you're debating emotion about capitalism, you should know that um who has the power, which is like many people that are elites, the 1%, who lacks the power, which is the masses, and more importantly, the people living like in poverty. So obviously, people living in poverty are more affected by capitalism over the middle class. So these are just like knowing structures and like powers and identity like within social justice motions. The third thing then is historical lenses. Um, what past injustice shapes present dynamics, right? So colonialism, slavery, police brutality, forced assimilation, etc. So if you're debating emotion about, for example, racism, uh, historical lens is going to look like things like slavery and colonialism. So those are one of the analytical tools also in social justice movement. And then the fourth thing is agency lens. Does this motion give or remove agency from the marginalized group involved? So this is also a lens you can look it through to know how to best strategize your arguments. So then the next thing is about framework and argumentation. Uh, First thing is principled analysis. There are three major principles used in social justice debates. Firstly, the principle of moral redress. That is, if a group has suffered injustice, society owes them compensation and recognition. I think this is very self-explanatory. So, um, if, for example, you're saying women have suffered injustice in society due to patriarchy, then the principle is that society as a whole owes them some sort of like redress and compensation for this harm. Secondly, is then the autonomy principle. That is, marginalized people deserve control over decisions that affect them. Uh, all these things is just to show you how to shape arguments. So, if your arguments are in line with these principles, these are way you can analyze them and show how, like, obviously you are winning in a debate. So, the autonomy principle means marginalized people deserve control over decisions that affect them. So, obviously, you're debating in a round, and then your argument say, "Oh, argument is good because this gives minorities back the power to dictate how these policies affect them and give them back their voice." So obviously this is a principled claim and one that is very important in social justice debating. The third thing then is the dignity principle. So debates often hinge on whether something respects or harms their dignity. An example would look like this house will allow minority only universities. So autonomy would look like communities decide how to educate their youths. Dignity would look like um, freedom from hostile environments, and redress would look like correcting decades of systemic exclusion. So that's just like an illustration of those principled analysis I've given you. So it's moral redress, autonomy, and then dignity. And then there's impact analysis, right? That in social justice debates, impacts are not equal because obviously um, issues and policies are going to affect minorities differently than they affect people who are not minorities. So there are three levels of impact. There are material impact. So this would look like jobs, safety, money. There are psychological impacts, which are fear, trauma, belonging, and their structural impact, which are long-term systemic change. Right. So an example would look like policy reforms are structural impacts, safe spaces are psychological impacts, and scholarship quotas are material impacts. Debate should always weigh which matters more to the group in question. So that was why I said you need to know what these minorities are looking for, right? Um, because obviously a minority that's like a debate about capitalism and class, probably the impact that is going to matter more to them is like material and structural impacts, right? That is jobs, safety, money, quotas, things like that, over maybe psychological impacts like fear and trauma. So the next thing then is common argument sets. So obviously this is gonna differ according to the motions and stuff, but these are just like a bit of common arguments that you would mainly hear within social justice movement motions. So for government, you would mainly hear arguments like retributive justice, safety from harm, empowerment and self-determination, correcting historical oppression, breaking cycles of poverty, changing social narratives, and creating representation. Um, from opposition, you would normally hear backlash risks, losing access to mainstream resources, fragmentation and identity separation, entrenching victimhood narratives, practical enforcement problems, stigmatization, and loss of coalition building. So those are just some stock arguments that I hear mainly within social justice debates. So techniques to handle sensitivity. As I said initially, that one of the main reason why people say social justice movement debates are hard because of it's normally debates about like sensitive issues. So techniques to argue sensitivities are do not firstly avoid stereotypes. Obviously, I think I've explained this. So do not describe marginalized groups as helpless, monolithic, or homogeneous, because obviously, even though as one, as a movement, they are going to be fighting for similar things. Uh, people, individuals that belong to that minority group are obviously going to have different interests. So, for example, two black women are not going to have the same priorities. My priority might be my getting money and like getting good jobs and stuff like that. And the other person's priority might be different. Like they might not be so career oriented, right? So use phrases like a significant subset experiences for many in this group, particularly vulnerable members of this group. So these are just ways to avoid generalization, right? So even if you're saying, oh, many of them would want this, you're not saying all of them or this is how they behave, right? Then how to be compassionate but analytical. Because another trap that people fall into in social justice debating is that people just they think, oh, minorities are suffering. And then you say minorities are suffering for 5 minutes, you don't analyze, and it's just like, oh, emotional blackmail to the judges, but you are not really debating and you're not really analyzing anything. So, how to be compassionate but analytical? So, start from empathy, but argue from mechanisms. So, examples are instead of saying Black communities suffer to support them, say, due to historical redeclining and present policy biases, Black communities face systemic barriers to safety and mobility. This policy removes X barrier by doing Y. So you're not just saying that Black people are suffering or minorities are suffering, you're explaining that how the policy then is going to remove a particular barrier and how they're going to do it. So that is analysis. Then, um, emotional narratives are allowed, but must connect to impact. So I think the formula for this is emotion, mechanism, outcome, then impact. So example would include the emotion is fear. So minorities are afraid of this. Mechanism would be, oh, the reason due to them being afraid, they tend to avoid going to hospitals, right? Um, Outcome means because they avoid going to hospitals, they get late diagnosis, and then impacts will look like due to them getting late diagnosis, they have higher mortality rates like as minorities. So emotional narratives are allowed, but they must connect back to impact within the debate. So then, case building, right? Uh, so I'm going to use an illustration for this part of the session. So emotion example would be this house will allow minority communities to form self-policing neighborhood units independent of state policing. So government case structure would look like giving a context such as history of abusive policing, right? So minorities have suffered in the hands of general policing because of they stereotype them. So this leads to things like police brutality, etc. Uh, Model would then look like how does community policing work? Uh, so you can model this anyhow. Like a example close to me of community policing is um particular southwest states in Nigeria formed a group called Amotekun. So because they felt that they were being neglected, like in general policing and like on the federal government. So they formed their own community policing called Amotekun and armed them to protect those particular states from like intruders and stuff like that. So obviously maybe we can give an illustration or it can be unique, like just show us how this community policing is gonna work. So principles would look like then autonomy, safety, and redress. Right. So I think I've explained those principles earlier in the workshop. So I'm not gonna explain them again. So but those are maybe examples of principal arguments that can run in the round. Mechanism is going to look like cultural competence, lower violence escalation, and greater community trust. And then impacts are going to look like reduced harm, community empowerment, and long-term structural change. So this is an illustration of how you're going to build a case within a social justice debating round. Anyways, then an opposition case structure is going to look like context. Policing requires training and accountability. So not anybody on the streets can just be like armed and put in a force, whether community or general force, right? So the principles are going to look like equality under the law, prevention of parallel state structures, so preventing fragmentation of the states. Mechanisms are going to look like risks of corruption, vigilantism, and lack of legal oversight. So it's going to be hard to hold like this community police accountable because like they are not under like legal and federal oversight. Impacts are going to look like abuse of power, fragmentation of society, and reduced trust in national law enforcement. So like the third one now would be a very important impactor. Oh, if if you're complaining about exclusion as minority groups, this is probably going to further more exclusion and how it's going to affect you in the long term. So then, uh, you can practice this in your free time by picking any marginalized group, right? So it could be by class, by race, by gender, by sexuality, anyone. Then identify their material, psychological, and structural harms that these minority groups might have, like I have initially illustrated, and then build one argument using those four lenses. So identity lens, power lens, historical lens, and then agency. So then the next part is this is going to be rebuttal and weighing in social justice debates. Right. This is also a huge part of debating as a whole. So social justice debates obviously is not like it's not excluded. So social justice movements is not social justice debates is not excluded in this. So rebuttal techniques are firstly identify exaggerated victimhood or hero narratives. That's how maybe probably you can respond to an argument or like from either side. Secondly, challenge assumptions that all activists think alike. So, like the example I gave, that some debaters tend to fall into the stereotyping trap where they assume that everybody in a minority group is going to want one thing, right? So this is also a technique for you to rebut speeches like that, and also identify like maybe hero narratives or like exaggerated victimhood. So maybe a particular minority groups were minorities, but right now a lot of their issues have been solved or a lot of their issues have been addressed. So this you're going to obviously have to explain how these issues have been addressed and how it has affected the people within these minority groups. So then thirdly is to point out trade-offs. So short-term harm versus long-term liberation. So even if an argument is true and is proven, a way to go about it is to point out that maybe the impact of the argument is rather just going to give short-term redress, right? And then you can obviously weigh and then compare your argument that ours is better because we give like long-term liberation and like assess and then solve like structural and like long-term impact, right? So then fourthly, use intersectionality to show missing groups. So maybe the opposition argues for a particular minority that, oh, this minority is affected by this. You could also compare and use how maybe another minority might be affected by the policy that they argue for. So, like, this is just, as I said, obviously it's going to be unique to each motion. So, that's why I cannot get so specific in some of those things. But I think, like, this is understandable enough. Then, next thing then is weighing. And this is very, very important because I think weighing has been a neglected part of debates in general, even like apart from just like social justice debating, right? Like people give so much great arguments. And for example, in British parliamentary, where there's closing half, you see a closing will give such a great argument, but they would even forget to weigh it against their opponent. So like it then leaves a question of, oh, which one is the judge supposed to follow? Because most times judges are left to do the weighing themselves. So maybe, and it depends on the judge, um, how they are going to weigh different arguments and which is more important to them. So I think, like, obviously, you shouldn't leave it to depend on the judge to weigh your argument for you because then it might not always come up in your favor. So the way you can weigh arguments in social justice debate motions are firstly the severity of harm. So you can compare harms that um from both sides, that maybe your harm, if the case that you prove is more important because it prevents a greater harm than what opposition proves. Secondly, vulnerability of victims. So um our side is more important because we protect the most vulnerable members of the society over maybe opposition that doesn't do that, and their arguments are more general. So obviously, in debates, it's very important how, like, if you can prove that you're protecting the most vulnerable actors, it's like really good, because the reason why this is weighed very importantly is that, as I said earlier, different policies are going to affect different people differently. So a moneyed policy is going to have more impact on a poor person. So obviously, the poor person point of view is going to be more important in a moneyed debate over an elite point of view that is not going to generally matter to them. The third thing then is scope. So how many people are affected? This is another way you can't compare impacts. Like, if you can show that in your side of the world, more people are affected by, like, if your policy is not implemented, so more people are harmed, more people are affected. So there's a scope of impact, right, and scale of impact. Fourthly, longevity. So how long does it last? How long does the policy last? How long will the harm last if left unattended? So this is what longevity is. So the last one then is reversibility. So um if maybe each team proves a harm, you can also weigh that, oh, your harm is worse off because it is not being able to, it's not reversible. Unlike maybe ops harm that can easily be solved by doing so things. So I think it's important to note that it's not just using buzzwords in debating and knowing these are just strategies to use to implement in the way you analyze. So you actually have to give reasons for everything that you are doing. Like, you have to actually analyze those particular cases, right? So you can't just say, oh, we our side is better because we have greater scope of impact. You have to tell us why. And when you tell us why, it has to be like you are building a case too. So tell us maybe several reasons why this is true. Yeah, very importantly. So social justice debates usually reward deep and has nuanced learning, right? So like it has there's a lot of like nuanced learning to this, and it's like uh very important to know, because these are some things that you can also like use even in other motions that are not particularly about social justice debating, but also like having this information is good in everyday life, right? So um next thing I'm going to talk about is intersectional harm mapping. So how you can map harms across overlapping identities. Example would be Black women in policing. So this would look like race is the unique stereotype. So Black women, gender, vulnerability to sexual violence, that is women generally, class, over police neighborhoods, and history, long-term distrust. So I think this is it's just um using the tactic of intersectionality, right? Showing how different minority groups sometimes overlap because of one person might have different minority identities. So several things are affecting them. So maybe, for example, even though two people are Black, a Black woman is gonna have different issues than a Black man, because a Black woman also has the like overlapping identity issue of being a woman. So I think this is also important in when you're talking about identity nuances, because most times intersectionality is going to occur. So that is just like a very important aspect I also wanted to touch on. Right. So I think then um the this has mostly come to an end, so I'm just going to then summarize the key takeaways that you should take away from this session. Um, Firstly, use principled frameworks that I've already explained and how you can use them to strategize your arguments. Two, apply the four lenses, right, of identity, agency, and those ones. Three, be empathetic, but also do not forget to be analytical. So, um, I think something I missed to mention from this particular empathy and analysis is that there's a reason why most tournaments also have something like equity opt out. So, if you do feel like emotion is very, very overwhelming or um might give you PTSD. So maybe, for example, a victim of sexual assault might not want to argue emotion that has different, like, people arguing, like, they're going to have different illustrations of sexual assault, stuff like that. Then these you also have an option to opt out of particular motions that might be overwhelming to you. So this is put in place to also like protect minorities. So even though it's be empathetical and analytical, you also have to make sure that this is something you can participate in and may not be too overwhelming for you. If it is, then you likely should just opt out of those particular motions and round. So the fourth thing is focus on impact at structural and psychological levels. So um, as I said, you need to know what each minority wants, what they're fighting for, how best your side gives them those particular ones. So a particular ones might be good, but is that what the minority wants? Is that their main issues within the movement? If it's not, then um it's going to obviously be weighed as less important than a team that proves their main call of action within a movement. So last thing then is weigh based on severity, vulnerability, and longevity. So um that's how you weigh arguments, like how huge is the harm, um how serious is the harm, and how long does this last, right? uh then I think the last thing that I'm going to talk about is narrative framing. So instead of arguing what people should feel, we frame the story society currently tells versus the better story your side enables. So this connects more to like being empathetical but being analytical, right? So I this is a way to show society point of view to the judges to first of all break judges' biases, because I think this is also a thing that obviously judges might be more biased to protecting minorities within the round. So narrative framing is going to help like break judges' biases, creating memorable points and elevating clashes beyond surface level. Example would look like this house regrets the narrative that women must be resilient. So an OG might reframe the debate to say the narrative disguises suffering as strength. OO might reframe to say resilience is agency and survival strategy. So this is going beyond surface level to just say, oh, should women be resilient or not, but also showing how like this obviously is gonna be framed in a biased way for your side because it's a debate and you do want to win. So I think this goes among emotional surface level to depth of showing how the depth of motions and chats like that. So I think this would bring me to the end of the session. Um if you have a question, you can ask. I already see one in the chat, so I'm just gonna answer that. But if you have a question, I think maybe you can drop it in the chat or any way that you're more comfortable with. So let me read the question out. I often have problem reconciling some biases or knowledge I inadvertently have around something's an emotion. For instance, social messaging of my state or something like that. How do I work around them during debating? Also, what are some resources that you can recommend where we can read more about social justice and minority issues and so on? So I'm gonna talk about the first one, that is personal biases. I think I said it when I was starting the round that the easiest way to break personal biases is um trying so much to read lots of material. So the way I do is that I do not just read maybe content that are going to obviously confirm my own biases and my own political leanings. For example, I've had debates that I had to debate from a conservative point of view, even though I am a feminist in real life, and that is like a very huge part of because I studied law, and that is where I major mostly in international relations and feminism and stuff like that. So even though that's a huge part of my personal life, I've had to debate from conservative point of view. And that's because I've also maybe I try not to exist in an echo chamber where I am just reading and rewatching things that are closely aligned to my personal politics. So I think it's also trying to see the other side's point of view to also know how to debate. And I think it's very easy for debaters because there are so many motions that exist, and not all of them are going to be aligned to what you feel. So I think that you can incorporate this in your training to read large variety of materials to also have different point of view in order to prevent like personal biases as you are arguing motions, right? But also it's knowing how to, I think people say separate the art from the artist. That is why sometimes debating people before the debate, they are going to give, oh, these views do not align with my personal views and all. Sometimes in debating is also a form of, let's say, theater. And maybe this is easier for me because I also like heavily did theater. But I feel like you should know that sometimes debating is acting. Like you don't particularly agree with 100% of the things that you say within a round, but it's more about strategically winning and knowing how to position yourself in a round. So, all trying to separate those, but that particular round from who you are as a person. So separating the art from the artist is very important. In able to like debate motions without generally being so emotionally invested in particular motions, right? And then what resources can you recommend where we can read about social justice and minorities issues and so on? The first thing would obviously be the news, where personally I'm not someone that likes sitting and maybe watching 2 hours news sessions. But instead what I do is I follow like news stations on Twitter that I'm active on, or even on TikTok, things like that. That they post articles, and the articles are like you can read them in like 5-10 minutes. So those are like firstly this primary source of information and primary source of training. But also on YouTube, there's so much training on YouTube about social justice, motions, minority issues, like, and even sample debating. So you sometimes it you see debaters like that, what do you call it, that watch debates from early 2000s. Like this could look like structural competitive debating, but it could even look like just all these should I say podcasts that just bring two people to debate and all. For example, Royal Rhetorics, a debating society, a debating organization in Nigeria. That's one of the things that they do. So apart from competitive debating, they just bring like normal everyday people, influencers, all those things, give them a topic, and then you hear back and forth. So obviously a lot of them touch on like minority issues and social justice issues. So I think like those are like resources that someone can use in debating. So the next question is, for a judge, what are some things you recommend we should do to judge the round better? I think like the training focus in, also like applies to judging. So being able to separate your personal issues from a round as a judge is very, very important. So your personal biases. So you're mainly supposed to focus on how well the debater proves this thing, how well they analyze it, what mechanisms they use. So I think a good way I feel like judges, apart from, as I said, reading and trainings, is to also sometimes dabble into speaking. I feel like seeing debating from both a speaker as a judge greatly helps in judging, right? Because like you're able to understand various point of views from various sides when you're judging, but you can also like see it like in speaking. So like um how to defend one side like so passionately, even though you know that the opposition side might have some points and stuff like that. So I feel like that's very important for me. Trying to, even if there's nothing wrong with mainly judging, but maybe once or twice you could also like dabble into speaking and stuff to see debates from both point of view. The fourth question is, if we are speaking, how do we ensure that we use neutral or political correct language? I think this is more of an equity issue. And most times, as somebody who has also served on equity panels, the equity document is released mainly before the tournament. So I feel like a lot of things are covered in the equity document, how to address like speakers and stuff like. And I think the main thing, if you come from a whole perspective of avoiding generalizations, this helps solves like 90% of their issues, right? So generalization in both speaking, in judging, in referring to debaters. So instead of uh it's going to also influence how you speak during rounds, because if you're not generalizing debaters in a round, you're not going to generalize minorities as a whole. So it's those things I already touched on about how speaking about minority issues. So avoiding trying to say that minorities all want one thing, or minorities are known for this, things like that. Just having open-minded language. But obviously, I think that also most times they are not going to penalize you if you do not use political correct language. Like obviously they might ask you to apologize, but they're not going to severely penalize you. And I think at the end of the day, practicing it is going to make you get used to it. Like we don't start debating and everybody is just politically correct. Like it doesn't happen in a day. So I think like the more you debate, the more you get used to like the equity documents, the more you learn about social justice debating, the more you're able to put yourself in like other people's shoes, and like people that you are arguing or arguing against their lenses. That is how you're able to like know how to be like politically correct and like obviously be empathetic within rounds. And then the last question is, from the perspective of an actor debate, what are some frameworks that you recommend which would help us perform better as speakers in actor motions? So I think actor motions are unique because they are from the perspective of an actor. And I think this is different from the general social justice debates technique that I talk about as, for example, saying that all minorities want one thing. From an actor, right, is going to be this person, what is their interest, right? So it means that showing that this particular thing, obviously nobody is a magician in a round, and as debaters would say, we do not have the access to know what exactly that they want. But you can prove what is in their interest. If you can prove that this is in their interest, you are more likely to be able to show that this is what they would want because it benefits them. So that is the first thing that in an actor motion is proving what is in the interest of the actor. Before then, you can then go to the normal social justice framework and principles of seeing things like maybe identity, historical, things like that. But all these arguments must be tied to what is in the interest of the actor and how you're going to be able to get those benefits for the actor, and like how it's going to end up benefiting them. So therefore, you should win, right? So I think that those are the three main things to note in actor motions on social justice debating: showing, proving their interest, proving how they are going to act, proving how this would benefit them, then also showing us how then you're able to get those particular interests that you say would benefit them. So those are the steps by steps in proving like actor motions um like in social justice debates. So obviously you can find more robust information about this in like I said, those resources I earlier mentioned, like sample debates about that, and YouTube trainings, all those things. They are heavily available online, and most of them are free. So I think you can take advantage of this. So, um, yeah, I think those are all. Those are all the questions from the chat. So I think we will be coming to an end now.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you everyone for having me, and good luck.
Thank you, Peace, so much for coming on board with us and conducting this workshop. I'm pretty sure everybody who is listening in today live would have had to take away a lot, but also a lot of people who would be listening into this when we put it up on our channel would also get a lot of information out of this. So thank you again, Peace. Thank you for all the participants for joining in, and also thank you for everybody who will be watching this online. We hope to see you again soon in our next workshop. And Peace, we hope to meet you again soon for the channel as well. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.